Dale Earnhardt, Sr. What do I know about him? Not much I didn't know about him. And I miss him just as much as you Earnhardt fans, probably more. His father, Ralph, was a great friend of mine. In my early days, before I went to Charlotte Motor Speedway and Speedway Motorsport, I worked for Firestone Racing Division up in Akron, Ohio. And I had known of Ralph Earnhardt before I went up there, but I needed a test driver down in this area for sportsman cars. So I called Ralph up and I said, "Ralph, you be our test driver." Well, he knew he was going to get free tires from us by doing that, and of course he said a whopping yes. So every Tuesday I'd call Ralph. Now Ralph's different than Dale. Ralph looks a lot like, if you've seen Carrie Earnhardt, eyes spooky when you see Carrie, because Carrie and Ralph look just alike. Dale didn't look as much like Ralph, or you could tell they were father and son. So Ralph was a man of few words. When he got to the track, he was all cleaned up. He usually had this before guys had driver's uniforms. He had a white shirt, he had maybe blue jeans on, a pair of black shoes, and a helmet that wouldn't have protected you much. We didn't have good helmets back in those days. This was back in the 60s. So Ralph's favorite track was the Columbia Speedway, and that was a really gnarly old racetrack down on the west end of Columbia. And it was a half mile, and it was white clay. Not many white clay tracks around. Boy, it was, and it was flat, and it was tough. Didn't have really but about a groove and a half, so you had to root people out of the way to get around it. And Ralph played the NASCAR game as well as anybody. Ralph would run a 100-lap race, and maybe Don Bumgardner, somebody's leading the race, or Joe Penland, or Leroy Yarborough, or Cale. And with 2 laps to go, all of a sudden Ralph would come out of nowhere in second place. It'd bump, they'd go around it. Now Ralph was not a dirty driver. Ralph just waited. He didn't want people looking at his car a whole lot. And so he wouldn't race, and he won a lot of those races. So I'd call him on Monday, I'd say, okay, or Tuesday, I'd say, "Ralph, how'd those tires do?" It's a man of a few words. He said, "They were all right." That means they weren't very good. He never would say yes or no. "Well, Ralph, what do you think about the tires the next week?" And if he won the race and he really did good, he'd say, "Need to send me another set of them." That meant they were good. Next week I'd call him. Ralph finished third. I say, "Ralph, how'd tires work?" "Believing y'all ought to keep them up there in Ohio." That meant don't send him anymore because they weren't worth a hoot. So that's kind of the way Ralph's deliberations with me went. Although I could understand his language, and that's kind of thing about the South, while I'm talking about it. When I was at the Speedway, I had new people coming in, a lot of people coming in from upstate New York, Connecticut, Ohio, places like that. I said, first thing you got to know about these racers, because that's when they're mostly from the South, back in the 70s and 80s. Learn what they say and don't say. If they say, "I don't know about that," that means they don't like it. If they say, "Well, maybe I will," that means they don't really like it, but they might do it. Okay? That's just a southern way of talking. You have to translate what a lot of these people say. Now, a lot of these speech patterns are going away, because some of them come from the hills of North, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. Some of them come from the plateau of the Piedmont that's in the same states. People in the mountains speak different than the people in the flatter lands. Now, we got people from all over now, so they don't talk like as much as they used to, and you don't have to learn to translate all this stuff like you do. But it was funny seeing people go through this. But Ralph talked like he did, he acted like he did, and he was a fine man. I'll say that, he was a fine man. Now, did Ralph cheat? Well, everybody cheated back in those days. You were looking for ways to get around the rules, okay? I remember one time, Bobby Isaac, wonderful friend of mine, Bobby said, I found out what Ralph was doing. Why he ain't breaking no axles? I said, why is he not breaking any axles, Bobby? Because one day he was in the shop, and you know Ralph, Humpy, he was back there going over his car, every fine tooth and comb of it. And he said he found out, looking through it, that he had a axle key in the rear that was broken. Or it had a hairline crack in it. And he was worried about taking it down to Columbia and breaking an axle. Because if you broke it, your wheel wouldn't spin. The axle key locked the axle in. So he looked around, he didn't have one left. So Ralph's an improviser. So Bobby said what he did, he looked up there, looked through his toolbox, and he saw a Craftsman screwdriver. And he got it out and he looked at the shank. And it was about the same size as the axle key. So he cuts it off, he makes the axle key out of the Craftsman screwdriver crank. A certain size screwdriver. Put it in there, worked. Not only perfect, he never broke another axle key. Guy down at the Sears store in Charlotte, when he get a box of those screwdrivers in, old Ralph would go down there and buy the whole box. Now, who buys a box of the same kind of screwdrivers? Nobody does unless they got 24 people working for them and they're all mechanics and he's buying a screwdriver for them. That's where where he got the, he never told anybody. Ralph did a lot of innovative things. That really wasn't cheating. I mean, you could put in an axle key if you wanted to in. But Ralph was always improvising. But Ralph didn't have a lot of money. And he promised Martha one thing when he started racing. He was one of the first guys I knew to start racing full-time as a driver on the short tracks in sportsman cars and didn't have a job. Most guys, you know, mechanics, or they worked, Buck Baker was a bus driver, different people did different things. Ralph quit his job, and Martha said to him, honey, you can race full-time if you want to, but I want to tell you one thing. Don't ever take food out of my baby's mouths. And Ralph never did. And maybe that's a little bit why Ralph raced the way he did. He was careful. He moved when he had to. Now, this little young'un that was growing up in his house, Dale, he didn't race that way. He was wild and woolly. I think the first race that Dale drove, I promoted. I'd left Firestone. I'd gone over and went into partnership with a guy named John Gasky at the Concord Speedway, which was a neat little half-mile track. The shopping center's on it now. It's not the current Concord Speedway. That's where they moved to. But I enjoyed that and running there. And I remember Ralph called. I definitely wanted Ralph at the track because we were one of those Kannapolis people. So I made sure Ralph ran for us every Saturday night. And I remember one week, he said, well, Dale's coming over. Race, gonna be his first race. I said, okay. Well, I'd known Dale, you know, a little kid running around the shop. I didn't know if he could drive a race car. And that night, he couldn't. He was all over the track. I don't know how many times he spun out. But anyway, he was pretty wild and woolly, I remember that. Later on, Ralph and I talked a lot. But a really tragic thing happened. One day, Ralph dropped dead at his house of a heart attack. He was 45 years old. Dale was 23 at the time. And he loved his father like, you know, we all loved our father. But boy, they were really close because his dad was really helping him with a race car. Even though at that time, Dale was out kind of on his own. And so that started a whole new thing with Dale Earnhardt Jr. Life on his own without his father around him. And he was a holy terror on dirt. He really got where he could run a car extremely well. But at 23, he wasn't even close to making it. He had a long, long way to go. So that kind of started the first chapter with Dale Earnhardt Jr. Life without Ralph. Life without your father. Life without the man who you apprenticed for. Life without that steady guiding hand for that wild young boy that Dale Earnhardt was.